And I think that part of the reason why I became so burnt out as an academic and had so many mental health struggles was because my identity, I was expecting my identity to be wrapped up in my job as a professor, as an academic. And then when I didn't fit in academia, when it wasn't as rewarding as I thought it would be, when there was things I didn't like, I assumed I was the problem, not academia, because I thought, this is supposed to be a calling, right?
What does it mean to live a meaningful inner and outer life? And how do our personal finances fit in that? We tackle those questions and others in the School of Financial Freedom podcast. We talk about the role of money in our personal growth and spiritual liberation, the concrete math of budgeting and saving and investing, and how all this relates to the life you were meant to lead. Each episode is an interview with a former student of my online course, Financial Freedom 1, where they explain their favorite lesson and years later, what financial, behavioral, and spiritual impact it had on them. I'm Douglas Soy, founder of School of Financial Freedom, and your host. Glad you're here.
Hi, this is Christen, and this is the School of Financial Freedom podcast.
So today's lesson is 3.5, which is life energy, or your money, your life, which is the core lesson to the course. We go into Vicki Robin, who's a friend of mine, talk about one of the core principles in the financial independence movement, which is the idea that we exchange our time for money and vice versa. It is so important that I actually brought two people to talk about this lesson. Christen and Jorden took Financial Freedom, I think, in 2023, and they're actually in Financial Freedom 2 right now. But I remember very distinctly their reactions to this lesson, its effect on them. So let me introduce Christen and Jorden, and they'll tell you a little bit about themselves and why this lesson was important to them. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Douglas.
Thank you.
So Christen, Jorden, who wants to start? Tell us a little bit about yourself first.
Jorden, you can start.
Okay. I'm Jorden. I'm a professor. I'm Canadian. And I've taken Financial Freedom 1 twice, actually, and it blew my mind both times. And now I'm finishing up Financial Freedom 2, also blowing my mind.
And I'm Christen. I am a public school administrator for a small nonprofit charter Montessori school. And like Douglas said, I took Financial Freedom last year, the year before, the first one, and now I'm in 2. This lesson, was pretty resonant with me.
Well, first of all, I want to ask Jorden, what did you get out of Financial Freedom 1 the first time, and what did you get out of the second time?
Oh, that's such a great question. The first time, I would say this lesson on real hourly wage is the biggest thing that I took away. And I think the second time, what I took away was much more about how to be intentional and purposeful in your choices. I think at the time I was taking it, the second time I was also reading a lot about Tori Dunlop's financial feminist work. And so also working on trying to see money as more sort of morally neutral than I did the first time. That was a big take home from me.
Well, okay, even before we get into this lesson, tell us about Tori Dunlop's financial feminism.
Yeah, I love her work. I loved her book. I think the biggest thing I took away from her book was, two things. One, the idea that financial advice that men and women receive is very different. So, she talks about the research looking at how women receive advice about spending less. That's a majority of the financial advice, whereas men would receive advice about how to invest, for example. Women are told to buy less makeup and purchases and purses and stuff, and men are told how to invest, and that in and of itself creates a discrepancy. I think the second thing is also, again, that what you purchase is morally and values neutral as long as it fits your intentions. So there's not necessary rules about what purchases are good and what purchases are bad. It depends on the context and your own values and your goals financially.
So personal finance is used as a tool to beat on women by the patriarchy, basically.
Yes, exactly. That was Very eloquently said. Much better than mine. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things I think about with personal finance, one of the models I use is that there are three legs to the stool. There's what you make, what you spend, and how you invest. And fundamentally, you have to be good at all three. Like, it just doesn't work if you're good at one or two of them. You have to be good at all three of them. And what you're saying, or what Tori Dunlap is saying is, men are taught like, oh, like the stool you need to think about is like, I'm guessing not only investing, but earning. And with women, they're taught like only the spending issue, but the other two legs are critically important.
Yeah. And then also shamed for some of those purchases. Like she talks about how you'll see, women getting told to spend less on these frivolous things. And, whereas men aren't getting told not to spend on like their hobbies and interests. And there's also, this is probably off topic, but there's the entire like pink tax on women's purchases, which like, I think, maybe we'll touch on with the real hourly wage, but like there are certain things that women might spend money on related to work that men are not expected to spend money on, like makeup and particular clothes, because women will get seen differently depending, on how like casually they're dressed, for example, whereas men might get away with that.
Absolutely.
It's kind of baked in, right?
Yeah, it's a bunch of guests have touched on that issue, not only with gender, but also with race, too. But let's get into the lesson. The lesson is about the book, Your Money, Your Life, which started the whole financial independence movement. Any introduction to the book? Christen, you have the book in your hand, so...
Yeah, you read
I literally have the book in my hand. I can read the back cover if you'd like. But no, the book is amazing, and it's broken into different sections. And the subtitle is 9 Steps to Transforming Your Relationship with Money and Achieving Financial Independence. And I feel like Vicki does an amazing job of breaking everything down into very tangible steps. I know a lot of the stuff we cover in Financial Freedom 1, some of the basic pieces of that, but this goes into more in depth of like how to, like some really tangible action steps you can take and starting to rethink your relationship with money.
Well, in the lesson, it actually starts off with a picture of Rupert Murdoch, who is 93 years old. And the first question in the lesson is, and I'll just ask the two of you, if this guy wanted to give you $100 million to trade places with him, would you? So first of all, would you take $100 million to trade places with Rupert Murdoch?
No. He's an old white guy. I don't want to live the old white guy lifestyle. But no, Rupert Murdoch's life is so different than my life. I'm like forging my own life here. And like I have relationships with people and friends and pets. And I like my own life. I wouldn't want to trade with anybody else's life, I don't think, just in general.
Yeah, same. That life is not appealing.
Well, the main point of it is that he's 93 years old, right? Like you would not trade, like you could have your own, let's just pretend you could have your existing life, but you'd be now 93 years old and have $100 million more.
Oh,
no.
Right. So the point of that question is life is actually more important than money, right? And so it's just an introduction into Vicki and Joe's idea that, we exchange our life energy for money and vice versa. And so whenever we spend money, we had to earn that money by giving up our life energy. Thoughts on that?
I think that lesson, and, when I read that in the book, made me think a lot more about how valuable my life energy is, and intentionally using that life energy and reflecting on where it was going. I hadn't really thought of that before that lesson or read the book.
I agree with that, Jorden. I think when I did that lesson and I read that in the book, I also was struck with how I can become more mindful and more conscious about my habits and how I'm spending my time and with whom and how I'm spending my energy. And, in terms of like consuming, like things are not going to bring me happiness. They're just not, just items, and I grew up in a household that was like, my money scripts are very much like my mom was, she spent a lot and she had a house full of stuff when she passed and it was just very consumer driven. And me being the person that had to go through all of those things when she passed, I was like, oh, this is not like, you can't take all of this stuff with you. This is not her. This is not this life. This person has passed on, but everything that remains is not her. And so I started applying those things to my life because I'm like, I don't want to come to the end of my life and just have a house full of things that my kids are going to have to go through. And that's just so not meaningful. It's just items, it's not anything of substance or value. And it also doesn't bring me any joy, Yeah, I thought that was really, really the crux of it for me, was like your life energy, and being more mindful about my life energy and how I'm spending it and how I am maybe sabotaging it in some ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm just curious about your mom. Like, when she was buying the thing, she thought it was going to make her happy. And it actually occurs to me that the actual buying of the thing made her happier than perhaps the actual owning of the thing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think she came from an era where I think generations before her, having things was like a sign of status, right? And so accumulating that and having it on display was kind of like, see, I'm doing something. I'm making myself in the world. I'm here. But I think also a lot of it was the thrill of the purchase, right? She was like an antique collector. So she would like go and try to find the best bargain. And then we would have like this house full of these useless antiques just collecting dust, right? So it wasn't really about joy per se. It was more just like she was fulfilling some other like lack of her in her life, some emotional need through this spending. And so growing up, I saw that, and I think that's part of my conditioning, because now I'm like, oh, if I'm stressed out at work or whatever, I'm just going to go buy something, because there is that dopamine hit of like buying, a new dress or a new, I don't know, whatever the next gadget is to make me like feel better in the moment. But in the end, it gets delivered and I'm like, why the hell did I buy this?
Going to that experience of like buying stuff, which I think is similar in my family. I'm like an anti-stuff person. Like, stuff stresses me out. It makes me feel claustrophobic. But I also realize, like, going back to life energy, that the more stuff I own, the more time I have to spend cleaning up the stuff, dusting the stuff, putting the stuff away, finding space for the stuff. And I resent spending, I got to the point where I resent spending my time dealing with my stuff. So I'd rather just have less of it.
Yeah, it occurs to me that like this whole spending thing is really about agency and control. Like, for perhaps your mom and maybe even you, like, spending is like, when you feel stressed, a way of claiming control back. And like for me, who has money vigilance, spending actually makes me feel out of control. It makes me feel like I have less agency. So, it goes really back to our money scripts. But to go back to the lesson, it's this whole idea that we spend hours of our lives earning money, and then we spend that money, i.e. those hours, on purchasing things. And, if you keep on doing that, you'll remain in the work spend cycle forever. The average American spends 90,000 hours of their lifetime working. Because I retired at 42, I actually only spent 30,000 hours working. So I spent literally 1/3 the amount of hours working than the average American. And that's because, instead of spending things or spending my money on things, I actually took that money and invested it. And now that money actually creates more life hours for me.
That makes me want to retire. Yeah, I want to retire right now. That's my inspiration there, is like, 90,000 hours versus 30,000 hours.
Yeah, it's funny because, when Vicky and Joe wrote this book in the mid-90s, Your Money, Your Life, they literally thought it would change the world. They actually wrote Your Money, Your Life as an environmental book because they noticed the environmental collapse that's happening in the world, climate change and everything else. And they thought if people would figure out that they could work less by destroying the environment less, and they could gain back their lives, everyone would do it. And the greatest disappointment of their lives is that did not happen. Any thoughts about why that didn't happen? Like, why people just don't get this?
I think that people don't like to do hard things. I think it's really hard to examine your own habits and thoughts and beliefs around things. I think money, Jorden mentioned a while ago that, talking about money is pretty vulnerable, right? So I think people avoid that at all costs. I mean, in general, but I think people things that are easy and convenient, right? Is very easy and convenient to just have things delivered to your doorstep or to maybe ignore certain truths, right? Rather than doing the work of unpacking and examining deeply held beliefs. That's just my guess.
I think I lay blame a little more at the feet of capitalism for that but I also agree with what you're saying, Christen. I think that, there are billions of dollars invested in making sure that we don't think about climate change and we don't think about the environment. Or, we're finding now that companies knew about this in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And, and now, like in the 90s, we didn't have targeted ads, social media algorithms. Like, I think there's so much money spent on helping us avoid those truths that it is so difficult to stand up to those and push back against those. And I think for me, decreasing consumption is linked to a value environmental sustainability. And I can see in generational differences in my family that value is really different than other generations in my family who did not grow up in the same environmental awareness and don't link buying things to the environmental impact. Like, that link is not there for them in a way that it's constantly there for me. Like, where is this product from? What is this product made out of? Did I get this locally? Like, there's a lot that I think about that, in the 90s, people weren't thinking about.
It's interesting because what you're saying is absolutely right. There are billions of dollars spent, and some of the brightest minds in the world work on the idea of just trying to sell you things, right?
Yeah.
Like, it is what our entire economy runs on, the fact that people will buy more than they need. In fact, I think one of the scary things, which I don't talk a lot about in the course, is if people actually stopped buying more than they needed, the economy would probably collapse. And so that's one of the big paradoxes that is really hard to unravel. But let's go into the second part of the lesson, which I know both of you have a lot to talk about. It actually connects a lot to the work that you're doing in financial freedom too. And we'll talk about that too. But real hourly wage. Christen, you just reread the chapter last night. So you want to start us off with explaining real hourly wage?
Sure, I'd love to. So real hourly wage is calculating essentially what you have left over in terms of energy. And I'm going to do a horrible job of explaining this, but basically you take your hourly wage, right? And the one that you get on paper from your job. And then you start subtracting out the things that you need in order to do your job, the things that are necessary. Like, you might need to have certain clothes to wear to your job. You might have expenses with transportation and commuting. You might have expenses towards relaxing in the evenings or taking vacations, or because you need a vacation from your job, right? You might have a deduction for like health, right? So maybe your job is stressing you out and you're getting acupuncture every week and you're getting massages once a month, and that also comes out. And in the end, it whittles down to your real hourly wage, what it is you're actually making per hour with this job that you have, and how it's affecting your life hours and your life energy.
Anything to add to that, Jorden? Just the explanation of real hourly wage?
I don't think so. I think Christen did a great job of describing it and how to calculate it.
Yeah, that was a good explanation. Just to add a little more color to it, like, you subtract them, even the most basic things like taxes, right? So, like, the minimum federal income tax is 15%. In Oregon, it's the state income tax is 8%. In Washington, there's no income tax, but then they have a sales tax, right, around 8 or 9%. And then on top of that, there is your Social Security and Medicare taxes, which is 15%. And so even out the door, you're almost at 40% just from taxes. So if you're making $50 an hour, even before anything else, taxes have brought you down to about $30 an hour. Continue, Jorden.
I think that then you add in the things that for many of us, like Christen said, have to spend on yourself to, I want to say, recover from your job or manage going to your job. I think when I calculated my real hourly wage the first time, the biggest shock was how much I was spending on things that made work more convenient. So like picking up my lunch on campus, or the sheer number of interventions I needed for my chronic pain, which is very much related to having been at a desk for a bazillion years of education. But like you add in those things, and my real hourly wage was so small compared to what I thought it was.
Mine was the same, Jorden. Like my expenses, like I am lucky enough to be able to live close to work, so I didn't have a lot of commuting expenses. I dress casually at work. I don't have any costuming needs or anything like that. But the whole thing about health and wellness and mental health and the convenience. I mean, I'm a single mom, and so it's hard to make meals, and I get home and I'm exhausted and I don't want to necessarily cook all of the time. So, eating out. And so all of those things added up. And then my real hourly wage was very sobering and humbling and fairly depressing.
Well, approximately for the both of you, what percent of your real hourly wage, of your nominal hourly wage, was your real hourly wage? What was the discount?
I don't even know the discount, but I'll tell you, my real hourly wage was like $13 an hour.
Yeah, like, each time you've told me that, like I can't get over it.
You can't get over it. I'm living the dream, Douglas. I'm living the $13 an hour dream here. It's ridiculous.
I think mine was like I'm fairly well reimbursed for my time as a professor and a clinical psychologist. And I want to say like something ridiculous, like it was like, I don't know, like $30 an hour, but like the actual wage was like triple digits. Like I was losing a ton. Yeah. And just like spending, my time was all going to work too. So like I've talked about this, Douglas, as one of my big take homes that you reminded me of, is just like, the more I overwork as this person receiving a salary, there's no financial incentive to that. So like I was working these insane weeks of like, 50 hours a week or like the odd 60 hours a week, which then further brings down my real hourly wage. And it just was I think one of the most sobering pieces for me was realizing the connection between my wage, my real hourly wage, how much time I was spending on work. And like, if you think about it in terms of like spending money to buy lunch when I'm on campus, spending money on physiotherapy and massage and psychotherapy, that like the harder I worked, the more of those things I needed. So I was like just further suppressing my wage. And it was just like this like active vicious cycle. It wasn't like this thing that was necessarily happening to me, this low real hourly wage. It was like I was producing this low real hourly wage. And it was, I don't even have an adjective to describe like the reaction I had when I put all those pieces together. Like it went way beyond finances.
What do you mean?
I just think it in the terms of like, so like one of my areas of personal and professional interest is in like self-care. So like, real hourly wage, when you get down to like just the nuts and bolts of it, is like, hey, like how much, are you really taking home after you account for all these expenses? But for me, it went into like mental health issues, physical health issues, existential, like, do I even want to be doing this job? Like, it's costing me so much. And then to see like, to be like cruising along thinking like, yeah, I make a really good wage. And then to realize like 70% of your hourly wage is actually like going back into work or taken off in those expenses you mentioned. I just like, it was like a whole lifestyle evaluation. It wasn't just like about real hourly wage. It was about my whole life.
in a real way, I mean, it goes all the way back to the Rupert Murdoch question, right? Like, if work is eating up so much of your life energy that you don't have any life energy for anything else, it's not worth any amount, right?
Exactly.
100%.
Now, it's funny because, Christen, you're like the number one administrator at your school. You're making $13 an hour.
Yeah, what does that say for my staff, right? I mean, I'm the school administrator. It's a small nonprofit charter school. I won't say that my salary is on par with other school districts for any rate, but I feel like the real hourly wage was sobering for me, because in my job, the role that I play, I end up holding a lot of the emotional climate of the school. And so there's like a lot of mental energy. There's a lot of emotional caretaking that I do in my job for the community, right? For families, for students, for staff, and the community at large. And so I feel like that's even more insulting. My real hourly wage is even more insulting because it's heavy work that I do. And so, yeah, it just makes me reevaluate the job that I'm in and what I need to do to change it all.
It's funny you say that, because I used to be a school teacher, and I was at a Quaker school. I made $35,000 a year, and I thought I loved it, and I did love it. And like, the intensity of it meant that I could do nothing else. Like, even like summer vacations were spent recovering from the school year. Winter vacation, spring vacation, like all of it was spent recovering from the school year. And at some point, aside from the incredibly low salary, if you don't have a life outside of the thing you're doing, they could be paying you infinite amounts, and the real hourly wage is still becomes zero, right? Like, mathematically.
Right. And the other thing is, you could have a life outside of what you're doing, but you might not have the energy to fulfill that life, right? I'm an artist as well, but I sometimes come home and I have no time to be creative, right? I'm exhausted from the day. So I'm like, oh, I'll look to spring break. I'll look to the summer. I'll just be in my studio all summer. But then I'm like, I'm just going to lay in a hammock because I need to decompress from everything. And I think it's hard for people that are in professions like the medical profession, the education profession. I mean, these are caretaking roles in society that are not necessarily well compensated, but they do hold a lot of that energy for people, and it is really hard. Long hours and emotional caretaking.
And what you're implying is also like the emotional energy you're giving to work is also sacrificing at some level the energy that you would want to be giving to parenting.
Correct.
Oh, yeah. 100%. And especially like when, parenting is one of the most important roles that I have in my life. And, if work is taking up all that energy, there's nothing left to give at home. And especially as a single parent. And yeah, I think the real hourly wage that lesson has made me so much more aware of, for me, containing work, because before that, work was really, my life was centered around work. And I think that this is maybe in a later chapter in that book, and something that I've incorporated into my own like self-care book that I've written, which is like, the only thing a job can give you that something else can't give you is a paycheck. That I don't look to my job to fulfill those other values or roles as much anymore. And that also came out of calculating my real hourly wage. Like, I felt like I was betraying myself somehow, because I was spending so much of what I actually was taking home, I was putting it back into work. Like, and I almost felt like they're making money off of me. Right? Like, I am, spending all this money on these things to make my work life easier so I can be more productive for my employer. And I'd rather spend my energy on myself and my child.
Right now in my current cohort of Financial Freedom, there's someone who works as a nurse practitioner. And one of the things she realized is that work is structured to only pay for the patient hours, but don't actually pay for the charting hours. Mm-hmm. And so structurally, they have required you to do non-paid hours. And I assume in education, because we've all worked in education, that it's the same way, right? They're not paying you for the evenings that you're working.
No, and they know that, to me, this is where you get into things like passion exploitation, in the sense that, at least at a university or college, I think that they know you're not going to screw over your students because you want them to learn, you want them to have a good experience. So, they can kind of make that like unpaid labor because they know you're not going to do that. And so, they can burden you with lots of other work. For example, not hiring enough like staff support, not administrators. That's a different scenario. But, trickling down to increasing your workload, knowing that you're still going to bring your best to the classroom, because most of us value that. Like, not everybody, and that's where, for example, that nurse practitioner, like, that's exploitative to build in things for work that you're not going to pay people for.
You're bringing up something that is the sore spot for me, which is when I was a teacher, I would see older teachers work far less. They were just coasting. And it really bothered me because I was working literally 80 hours a week trying to bring my best, as you're talking about, Jorden, and realizing, and maybe the older teachers had just figured it out, right? There's no way you can actually do this job if you're trying your best. But one of the key lessons in real hourly wage is that in order to do anything, you have to find a way to increase your real hourly wage. And realizing, and that's why I left education. Like, I couldn't do this job according to my sense of integrity and to my sense of identity and make a living.
Yeah. I think it's the same in higher education. I used to, look at senior colleagues who I didn't think were working as hard. And now I kind of feel like I am that senior colleague. I'm like, oh yeah, no, I'm not giving my whole life energy to this. This is just a job. And yeah, I like what you said, Douglas, about integrity, right? And I think when I calculated my real hourly wage and realized how much I was sort of, quote, like, giving back to my job financially, that didn't feel like it had integrity to me. Like, my real hourly wage should be higher for what I'm doing, is essentially like one of my take homes from that calculation. I have since, in the intervening years between like the first time and the second time I took it, I did increase my real hourly wage. But yeah, I think one of that first messages was like, this is not matching my values. This is not how much I want to be making.
Yeah, I was just going to say, increasing my real hourly wage requires me to basically find a new job and or, reduce the amount of things that I'm subtracting from that wage, right? Which I'm kind of at the bare minimum right now. So it's really finding another job that is not going to suck my life energy out, siphon it.
Well, that's an interesting thing. Like, with this calculation of real hourly wage, Christen, you could probably get a job. I mean, we've talked about this. You could get a job outside the nonprofit and industrial complex that pays you more and requires less of you. But the thing that, and I think Jorden is pointing to, is we take on jobs as a matter of our identity, right? We believe in the jobs because we think that's their expression of our values. And at the same time, because they're expression of our values, we get exploited by them.
Right. But that's also like another lesson. I don't know. I can't remember if it's in Financial Freedom 1 or 2, where you have that big Venn diagram of like your passions and your vocation and finding that middle path. And sometimes it's just basically a job is just a paycheck. Like, you're using that paycheck to actually go and pursue your passions and your vocation. And so you're using that as a means to get to, fill your values and be fulfilled as a human being on this planet. Right. So I feel like it's all connected, right? All of these lessons are connected. They're not in isolation.
Well, it's so interesting because I think about, like, we're the three of us are in our 40s or 50s. Like, this whole idea of a job being a paycheck. I know that if I heard this in my 20s or 30s, I'd be horrified.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I think that's like, I don't know if this is like, as a child of the 80s and 90s thing, that message was like, you can be whatever you want to be. like, what are you interested? Pursue that at university. And I think that part of the reason why I became so burnt out as an academic and had so many mental health struggles was because my identity, I was expecting my identity to be wrapped up in my job as a professor, as an academic. And then when I didn't fit in academia, when it wasn't as rewarding as I thought it would be, when there was things I didn't like, I assumed I was the problem, not academia, because I thought, this is supposed to be a calling, right? And now I kind of see it as like, if I can get some of my values met through my profession, I'm a really fortunate person. And that's just a nice bonus. But, I don't have to have my identity so wrapped up in my job. And it's hard though, because I think like you talk about people in their 20s, for example, working with students, I think that they expect your identity to be wrapped up in your job and sometimes expect you to go above and beyond in ways that is not in your best interest, both emotionally and in terms of your real hourly wage, because they also assume, that's my identity, that I'm a professor and that's the only role they see me in. Right. So I think that it just speaks to the messages we receive and wondering, why do we receive that message that our job should be our calling and who we are? And is that in capitalism's best interest? Yes, I think so, because it leads to things like you doing unpaid work. I'm on a soapbox now.
Yeah, it's funny because I also take a different perspective. You take the capitalist perspective. I'm taking the privileged perspective. Like a lot of this is status climbing, right? Like we pretend the salary or the income doesn't matter. Like we're rich people, right? Like,
yeah,
right. Like the very rich can pretend that money doesn't matter, right? They can take nonprofit jobs. They can, pursue their passions. And on some level, we're cosplaying as very privileged.
Yeah, I love how you put that. I think, I've received explicit messages in higher education around that. Like sometimes if you try to point out situations where you feel like you might be working too much and, actually literally hearing colleagues say, well, we make really good money, so having to do this thing is not that big of a deal. You are really well paid. Or, I've had conflicts at work around intellectual property and, literally being told by someone in a position of power to me, yeah, I don't think about this in terms of the money, because we make good money. And it's like, well, yeah, kind of, I guess compared to some people, we make good money, but I also have a real hourly wage that's $30 an hour and that's not going so far. So I think it is cosplaying as people who don't have to care about salary. And then, I think in higher education, at least in Canada, some of the salaries are quite high. And I have colleagues making like $80,000 a year more that are in theory doing the same job. So like, yeah, I think it is cosplaying is not having to care about your salary. And then if you bring up things like salary, when you make six figures a year, it often gets suppressed by people saying, well, you make good money. You're lucky.
I wonder how many of those people who say those things either like have the privilege of a free education or have inheritance coming to them. And like that's just an honest question, right? Like, it tracks to both wealth and race, right? Like for the majority of white people, they will receive some inheritance. And so when you're backed up by that, you can make different choices where money matters less. But, like in poor communities, the money is going to support older generations as opposed to younger generations. And so, yeah, just another thing I'm thinking about.
I think in general, going back to Christen and what you were saying, we talked about before we started recording about me saying, it's a financial podcast, so I feel way more nervous, is just the social norms around, at least, in my level of income, around not talking about money, right? Like, don't talk about your salary. Don't complain about your salary. That's, I think, another way we replicate and continue these differences is by not encouraging any conversation around money at all. And, financial freedom 1 and 2 creates a place to talk about money. I think that's part of why it's so powerful when you're in that with your cohort, because you're finally talking about numbers.
I agree. And also, one of the beautiful things that I got out of Financial Freedom 1 and 2 is that working in community with people that are also having the same conversations and being brave enough to talk about it. And then also being able to like branch out. So there's a few of us that meet, like once a month, just as an aside, and just talk about it. And I find that that's so helpful for me, because before I didn't have people to talk about this with. And so being able to support one another and cheerlead, but also commiserate and parse out all of the things is really important to me, to be in community with people that are also talking about money. So I really appreciate that about both the 1 and 2 cohorts.
So you took Financial Freedom 1 at the end of last year, and you're currently in 2. Just generally, what are the things you're thinking about or working on since learning about real hourly wage?
In 2, I've been working on paying off debt and investing like that. That's like what I've been focused on there. But the real hourly wage, like I have been actively looking for another job. I've been actively divesting my identity from my current job, right? And doing all of that mental work around that. And yeah, just trying to, like what Jorden was mentioning earlier, just leaving at the right time, like not putting in my overtime. I'm leaving at 4:00 every day. I am not taking work home with me. I am heavily boundaried around between work and my personal life. And so that's been quite freeing as well. So those are the things I'm working on right now.
Yeah, I love that. I'm working on a couple things. One of the biggest realizations for me in Financial Freedom 2 was that I have shame about spending money on literally everything. So it's just, sitting on my shoulder, walking around with me, and just realizing like how ridiculous some of that was. Like, feeling shame putting gas in the car, feeling shame buying groceries, like literally every expense had this like, oh, you should not be spending this money, which is ridiculous. So working on like constantly reminding myself, like, my choices are morally neutral. My choices they only matter to me. Money is just money, and not having to have shame about spending money, which was coming hand in hand with anxiety, like so much anxiety about the future. And, I remember working through several lessons in Financial Freedom 2, where we had to kind of like take stock of where we were and realizing like, I'm fine. I'm on track. I'm going to retire. It's going to be fine. I would love to be investing more. And I'm thinking a lot more about what I want retirement to look like. But like, no, I'm not going to end up destitute, when I retire, because that was the narrative that was coming along with the shame. So like working on my mindset. But I think I'll also like working on increasing my real hourly wage, both like I think I've done a good job of trying to curb the spending money back into work thing. Like I've worked on that a fair, but now like I know there was a lesson, Douglas, where you had to set what was called like a big, hairy, audacious goal, I think is the way you put it, of like, okay, if you had to set this like goal for how much you want to make an hour, what would it be? And so I picked $400 an hour, which feels ridiculous to say out loud. And so what I've been working on is figuring out how I'm going to make that happen. Like, and that's my goal for like 2024 is at least once I want to be paid that much an hour. So I've been working on figuring out how to make that happen, because I think I realized I had like a ceiling on income, and there was a lesson that was like, what if you didn't have a ceiling? And I didn't even know I had a ceiling until we did that lesson. And then I realized I had one.
So that big, hairy, audacious goal, what I ended up doing with that is that I set some big, hairy, audacious goal. And I ended up at work, we had to change our passwords, we had to change our passphrases, like we do it once a year. And so I made my passphrase the hairy, audacious goal. So every day, every time I get locked out of my computer, I type in how much I'm going to make an hour at some point in my life. And I just type it. That's like my whole password now. And so I remind myself of it like daily. It's now like a mantra that I have. So it's like always looping at the forefront of my mind.
Well, so a couple thoughts for both of you. So first, Jorden, I remember when you actually told us your numbers in FF2.
That was
right?
really hard, by the way. That was so hard because, yeah, that was hard.
I think you had to do it a couple times because it didn't make any sense what you were saying through FF1 and the first part of FF2 and what your actual numbers were, right? Like your actual numbers, like you were absolutely fine, but the narrative you had for months on end was like you didn't have enough, and it was just, and I think that is like one of the core things that like it's not even in this lesson, but like the numbers will tell you what's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it was your money scripts or it was your anxiety that thought that made you think you didn't have enough.
Yeah. And I think related to that, Douglas, I realized it's difficult for me to take pride and pleasure in that. Like, it's difficult for me to say, like, hey, like, look how hard you've worked. Like, look how hard you've worked. Look at what you've done. Yes, I had privilege. I have a background that helped me get the education, and look at the choices you made and you're doing okay. Like, you have a pension, you have investments. It's very difficult for me to actually just sit and take pride and pleasure in that. I think that's also the shame and anxiety is like, you're not supposed to feel like good about your money because then you're just a jerk or something. So I think like, yeah. And I didn't trust the numbers. I think I did it 2 or 3 times because it just was such a mismatch between my mindset and my money scripts and the actual numbers. I didn't believe them. And I remember you asking me at one point, like, what would it take for you to actually believe these numbers? I don't even remember what my answer was, but I do remember you saying, like, what would you need to actually believe these are real numbers? I was like, I need to do it again.
Well, I mean, and that's what happened to me when I hit FIRE. Like, I had to do numbers over and over for months on end because it's hard to disbelieve you're something that you have believed for years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And, one of the things I always say is like, when you look at your money, you're really looking at your life. And what you're saying is any objective ability to do so, you aren't unable to have pleasure with your money.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And so,
I think it's good.
Part of your growth edge is actually just to enjoy your life and to take pleasure and know that money is there for you.
Yeah. And I think that it's surprising how hard that is. Yeah. And like right now, for example, I'm beginning to think like I'm getting rid of all this extra stuff and I'm beginning to think about like, what do I want to spend money on in my life? If I have some that I have to spend, I don't have to feel shame. And that is actually proving itself to be very difficult. Like thinking, I think there's a lesson maybe in Financial Freedom 1, Douglas, where you talk about asking your friends, like, do you have anything for my new house that I can like put in my space and furnishing your house that way? And one thing that I'm actually really struggling with is like my physical space and like, hey, it's okay to spend money because you want your physical space to be nice because that's okay. You're allowed to decide what to do with your money. You're a grown up. There's no right or wrong choices. Like the first time I went through Financial Freedom 1, I think I didn't really internalize the lesson about money scripts. And I was kind of like, yeah, I have these money scripts. And like the second time through and through Financial Freedom 2, I'm like, whoa, actually, these are really driving the bus. Like, I really need to do some work on these.
Jorden, I'd be happy to come up and spend your money and decorate your house for you.
Yes, I might need some help. That sounds great.
I would love nothing more.
Well, any other thoughts?
I'm just grateful for this conversation. I like talking with you two about this wildly popular topic.
I think it's so refreshing to have a space to talk about money. Yeah. And I think that one of the last thoughts that I have is just, as someone who has been in, researching self-care and wellness and living your best life, I really underestimated the role of finances in that. And, how much like real hourly wage is and life energy is really about what's core to you, what you want your life to look like. It's not just money, it's how you want to live, and that you need to actually pay attention to your money and pay attention to your money scripts in order to do that.
I also think the visualization piece too, that one exercise in towards the end of Financial Freedom 1 where you make the video and you talk about what your goals are, right? And what like this is what I'm working towards. This is my vision, right? And I try to keep that in mind often when I'm, budgeting or trying to make ends meet or making decisions about investing and my work-life balance, about this is what I'm working towards, right? So I always like to keep that in the front of my mind because if I lose that, I'll have a tendency to kind of like lose my way a bit. So I try to make it a habit to kind of keep that vision there so I can mindfully make choices around it.
It's interesting because I would actually, I'd encourage you to go back to your videos that you made to see what you said, because one of the underlying themes I'm beginning to hear from both of you is that because it's been hard to get pleasure outside of work, you've dived further into work for
yeah,
for affirmation and identity.
100%. I mean, and work is like, I've done so much therapy about this, Douglas. I feel like for me, work is the place that's a great place to hide out when you want to avoid something. Like, I'm good at it. I can produce something that's tangible. Like, there's very few areas of my life that can go as easily and be that dopamine hit as work. So for me, work can be a hiding place.
It's the opposite for me. Work is not a hiding place for me. Work is very taxing. And so I am, trying to find other work that is not as taxing and that is more paycheck based so that I can pursue those passions and lifestyle that I'm craving. Like, especially my creative life has been lacking because I've been busy with work and busy with caretaking and childcare and parenting and all of these things. So everything's changing though. Kids get older, their needs change, my needs change. Yeah, I am definitely not taking a refuge in work. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, and I to clarify, my refuge is not a helpful one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's not a good place to hide out, but it is an easy place to hide out.
Well, it is. I mean, a lot of people, one of the major reasons people overwork is because they feel competent at work, right?
Yeah.
And they feel like this is a place where I have a sense of control and, achievement. Whereas other places in my life may feel chaotic, like child raising.
Yeah. And, one thing that I think is related to that too, and goes back to like life energy and real hourly wage, that I'm kind of embarrassed to say is like, I really struggle with time that's not producing something. Like, I'd like to settle into like, quote, unproductive use of time, even though I've been working on it for so long, is very difficult for me. Like, if my time's not worth something, it's like I have a hard time just settling into it, like being present in that moment, because I'm like, oh, this should be producing something.
Yeah, and that's sort of the capitalist ideology, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
One last thing I have for Christen is like one of the things I realize is it gets increasingly hard to look for other work when you're working so hard. You need the time, and that's the one thing you do not have.
Right. So this is exactly where I'm at. I am staring down the finish line of the school year, right? We're wrapping up in June. And so normally I would spend the summer decompressing, but I'm spending the summer, looking for, working on finding other things. So other avenues and other jobs. So it's very, that's the paradox, right? I don't have that time. I come home, I'm exhausted, and the last thing I want to do is make a LinkedIn profile or search job boards or, connect with folks. So, yes, it is very...
the exhaustion is part of the hamster wheel.
It is real. The struggle is real. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to sum it all up, it goes back to time, right? Like, non-productive time is... I've been writing a series of posts about doing nothing, and non-productive time is supposed to be the climax of life. And we've reversed it. We think that we're here, like we rest so we can work harder, where the whole point of this life was to actually just work so that you could have more rest and enjoy your life more. This curious thing about like the harder you work, the harder it is to imagine anything else, right? You talk about your creativity, Christen, and it's not only your, artistic creativity, but it's your own creativity about your own career. It's hard to like just even think expansively when you're exhausted. Wow, this was a little bit of a dour lesson. Last thoughts. Can we just say anything that perks the audience up as we leave?
Well, it is a long weekend here in the United States. Probably not in Canada this weekend, but
Canada.
I have been leaning into nothingness. And I read a book yesterday, which was fabulous. And I am very excited about doing absolutely zero and then returning to work on Tuesday and just probably doing less than usual. I don't know. I'm doing good. I really like the break, so I'm just taking care of that.
Awesome. I think it's not a long weekend here. We had a long weekend last weekend, but I think that like the real hourly wage lesson was difficult and, perhaps kind of dour, but sparked a ton of positive change for me. Like there has been a ton of trickle down effect for me after calculating that number that has helped me be intentional about thinking how I want to use my time and my energy going forward. So it was a good lesson, even though it was a sobering lesson.
And I just want to end with this. We're three educators, and the whole thing is about education, right? Like, all this is possible with education. And it's just, I think it's a big problem that we do not actually teach kids personal finance. And like, we walk into adulthood and people have learned none of this stuff. And like, I think I don't know if it's purposeful or not, but I think this whole thing, FF1 and FF2 generally, reinforces the idea that education matters. And so I just want to give that to you, both as educators. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Douglas. It was awesome.
It was fun.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening. You've been listening to the School of Financial Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Douglas Soy, and stay tuned next week for another episode. Thank you for tuning in to the School of Financial Freedom podcast, where we ask, what does it mean to live a meaningful inner and outer life? And how do our personal finances fit into that? We hope you enjoyed this episode and it helps you live with an increasing sense of empowerment, integrity, and agency in the world. For more information, resources, and to re-listen to this or any past episodes, visit our website at schoolofinancialfreedom.com. There you can find out when the next cohort of Financial Freedom 1, the online course is. If you've enjoyed today's show, please consider leaving us a review, as it helps more people find us and join our community of people interested in the intersection of money and personal and spiritual growth. I'm Douglas Soy, founder of the School of Financial Freedom. You can also find me on Substack, where you can subscribe to my popular newsletter, Money and Meaning. I also love hearing from readers and listeners, so write me at www.douglassoy.com. I'm grateful that you listened, and I hope that this episode has given you hope and insight into taking control of your finances to live the life you want.